thanksgiving for the life of George Wiseman. We are here to remember rightly, and to reflect, and to mourn, and most of all to celebrate his life and express our gratitude for the good gift of his life among us. We are here to give our most fitting tribute and to give him to the love of God with all our hearts. Let's stand to sing the opening hymn. Eternal God, giver of all good gifts, receive our thanks for the life of your child, George Wiseman. May this occasion rightly honor him. May it give comfort to those who grieve. May it inspire us to live the lives we are given to live with gratitude and with great joy. Amen. Be seated. We invite now the reading of Scripture and the personal tribute that love is unto you.
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
First, on behalf of my family, I'd like to thank you all for the love and support these last few weeks. Your heartfelt condolences have helped me through this difficult time, helped all of us through this difficult time. Today, we're gathered to pay respects and celebrate the life of the man I've had the privilege and honor to call my father for 52 years. To sum up his life and influence upon not just me, but his family and friends, in just a few words, seems hardly to do his memory justice, so I will try to keep it brief. Dad was a wonderful man who was kind, generous, caring, thoughtful, witty, and a gentleman with unlimited devotion to his family and the people he loved. He was always in command of his emotions, rarely raising his voice, and never shedding a tear. In fact, the first time I saw him cry was when Mom passed away 7 years ago. Dad was a good listener who I always relied on for good advice and an encouraging word or two. He was a hard-working and dedicated company man who possessed the skills to be both a firm negotiator in business and a compassionate boss and friend to his colleagues. He made a lot of sacrifices in an effort to have a successful career and provide his family with a standard of living his parents did not have the means to provide. He never lost sight of his humble beginnings or where he came from, and stood behind his favorite football team, West Ham United, until the end. Dad's work involved traveling to the Far East and Australia for up to 8 weeks at a time. And as a child, I can remember sitting in the living room, looking out the window, awaiting his taxi with my mom. Dad always brought gifts for us from his exotic travels around the world. He would give me his leftover coins and paper money from various countries he visited, which over the years turned into a rather large collection. He brought beautiful dolls for Liz and ornate chess sets for Paul and me, all of the indigenous quality and craftsmanship of the lands he had visited. Mom and Dad would occasionally host elaborate dinner parties for upwards of 25 people. Mom would do all the cooking, and Dad in charge of the drinks. Not a bad deal, if you ask me. Entertaining friends and business colleagues from around the world, they began to gain an international reputation for their lavish parties and sit-down meals. I can remember in my early teens helping out at the bar, serving drinks to my parents' friends, and listening to stories from a very interesting group of people. They all had so much fun, and it was nice to be included. Dad was also very handy around the house, always fixing and mending what was broken or just plain tinkering around. He enjoyed gardening and growing flowers, which made sense, as growing up his mother had a flower shop for which he would ride up to London to gather fresh flowers for the day. Our garden was always well kept and tidy, no thanks to his sons who would rather be out playing than helping out in the garden. He built his own tool and workbench for both homes he lived in, and built one for me when I moved into my new home. When we moved back from Singapore to our home, which had been rented out for 2 years, Dad constructed a new deck out of the teak shipping crates our furniture was packed in and shipped back from Singapore. Talk about being resourceful. When I was around 8 years old, Dad got me interested in Formula One auto racing, an interest in which we both shared a lifelong passion for. Always calling each other to discuss the results. He had a passion for the Tour de France and cycling as well. He would call me time and again to discuss the tour as it went on for 3 weeks. And each time I would have to explain, Dad, I don't get that channel, I can't watch it. But he'd still carry on telling me about it and each stage of the race and the scenery with all the joy and excitement of a kid. Another thing Dad enjoyed and was very good at was napping. He was the king of the nap, anywhere, anytime. A trait I did not inherit, unfortunately. I think he may have developed this talent from the 24-hour-plus air flights to far reaches of the globe. As a young lad, Dad spent many hours sketching what he saw around him, scenes, people, buildings, and even airplanes. His illustrations were very accurate, detailed, and exhibited a keen sense of perspective. Some of these illustrations we still possess from when Dad was only 13 years old. In Dad's retirement, he rekindled his artistic talents and began painting in watercolor. The scenes he painted this time were not of English country cottages, but seascapes, fishermen, and more tropical themes. Dad's appreciation for the arts was also exhibited in the unique oil paintings he collected from his travels around the world and proudly displayed in his home. During his travels, he also collected sculpted figurines of wood, ivory, and bronze, and the floors of our house were always covered with fine Persian and Turkish rugs of wool and silk, which Dad had collected on his travels. Another passion of Dad's was music. He loved all types and genres of music, as long as it was good, and if you could dance to it, even better. In the 60s and 70s, traveling back and forth to England for business, he always made time to go to Covent Garden and catch the latest opera at the Royal Opera House, or go to Ronnie Scott's Jazz Club to catch Miles Davis, Ted Heath, or Charlie Parker. As I grew up, rather than Dad loathing my musical taste, he embraced it and became a fan of Bob Dylan, Santana, Steely Dan, and Peter Frampton, to name a few. I can still remember him cranking out "Frampton Comes Alive," "Do You Feel Like We Do," in Singapore in 1976. And as it turned out, I developed a taste and appreciation for a variety of music, including opera and classical. Thank you, Dad. We had many memorable times together as a family, traveling to England to visit our relatives, the Caribbean, Singapore, Florida. After years of visiting Florida, Mom and Dad eventually bought a place and retired there to make it their home for the last 20 years. As a family, we often spent nights together when on holiday there playing Shanghai, a card game in which Dad was a master, or going out to dinner or a nice meal, and usually end up someplace where you could dance. They loved to dance. Watching Mom and Dad dance was a real treat. People would often lean over and say what wonderful dancers your parents are. In fact, last time Abby and I were visiting Dad in Florida, he took us home at midnight because we were tired, dropped us off, and went back to dance till 2 a.m. in the morning. I was waiting up when I came home. Talk about turning. I was very fortunate to have gone on a trip to Malaysia with Dad when I was just 16 years old. At the time, we were living in Singapore, and I was on school break. We drove in Dad's sporty European Ford car through central Malaysia to the Cameron Highlands Resort, which featured, of course, a very good golf course that he wanted to play. Along the way, we stopped and visited Batu Caves, which had a 130-foot reclining Buddha made of gold in the depths of a large cavern in the cave. It was the strangest thing I'd ever seen. As we were driving through the winding jungle roads, Dad grabbed at his neck as though he had been stung by a bee. Upon close examination, I found a round pea on the floor. He had been the target of some prank by local kids with their blowguns. Dad ended up buying me one for a souvenir. We also went out to the Malacca Straits one evening to witness the great sea turtles lay its eggs, a once-in-a-lifetime event. Dad was very concerned when I pushed some Chinese boys off the back of a sea turtle that just laid her eggs. In retrospect, this wasn't a smart move, I guess, but they did back out. This was one of the highlights of that trip for me. And of course, Dad would say it was playing the golf course while having Japanese tourists shoot up on us, me firing back at them. Dad never let me forget the fact that I had left his favorite sand wedge behind in a bunker there. In fact, it was one of the last stories we shared together. Although traveling around the Malaysian countryside with a difficult teenager couldn't have been much fun for him, we did form a lasting bond on that trip and a lifetime of good memories. We had a very special, loving father and son relationship, Dad and I, one that I cherished and appreciated and relied upon not only for his insight and wisdom, but for his sincere words of encouragement and love. In many ways, Dad was my best friend. He was always there for me through thick and thin, and we talked almost every day. I looked to him for advice on all matters of life, or if I just needed a listening ear and his loving support. Dad always had the time for his family and friends. He is part of me that will always be there along with Mom. That is comforting in these hardest of times. During the last 18 months, Dad never ceased being strong and courageous. He never gave up the fight. He upheld his dignity and positive outlook in the face of all odds and was an inspiration to us right until his death. My father never complained, even though he endured chronic pain and suffering that no one should have to experience. In fact, he made it abundantly clear that he had enjoyed a wonderful, full life and had no regrets, and that we should remember that and use his strength as an example to go on to prosper with our own lives. I am very grateful to have had the privilege to aid my father during his final stages of life. It afforded me the opportunity to chip away at the debt one owes a parent who stood behind you and would have done anything for you. To look into his knowing and intelligent eyes and he back into mine, even when he was unable to verbally express himself, spoke volumes and conveyed a love and compassion so deep that it will endure in life and beyond. You are my hero, Dad. I love you.
I'm reading this on behalf of Kylie. My grandpa was unlike any other person I have ever known. He was genuinely kind, funny, thoughtful, and could always put a smile on people's faces. He was always positive, even through the roughest times. I could listen to him tell stories for hours. He would tell me about being evacuated from London, going to his mother's flower shop, hunting rabbits with friends, winning soccer and tennis matches, and being the artful dodger in the play Oliver. In Florida, we would go down to the beach and sketch. He showed me how to reach up to the sky and make a star, then touch our toes. He showed me his routine that he did almost every day, and then we'd go for long walks on the beach, splashing in the water along the way, finding seashells, and sometimes he would walk in the sand in front of me, making big footprints and doing all kinds of twists and turns for me to follow as I tried to step in his footsteps. One of the many things my grandpa taught me was showing me how to position my hands while I swam to get more speed. He's also the reason I became interested in soccer. Since he's so good at it himself, he showed me all kinds of fancy tricks and footwork he knew one summer when he was at our house here in Ann Arbor. I also remember painting with him in Florida, using the sketchbook and watercolor set that he got me. He was such a good painter and a big inspiration to me. He always reminded me to use good manners and to listen to your mom. My grandpa is and always will be my role model and hero. I am so glad to have known such an amazing person, and I will miss him and I will love him so very much.
The following verses that I'm going to read are usually read at weddings because they celebrate love. I've chosen to read them here because the ideas of how love should be are goals for all of us to strive to reach. And I feel that my father, although he was not perfect, of course, and he was not a highly spiritual man for most of his life, he embodied many of these fruits of the Spirit and character traits automatically. For many of us, it's a struggle to be humble, kind, and patient, and I'm the first to admit that for myself. But for my dad, it was a very rare occasion to see him impatient or unkind or overly proud. He was a true peacemaker. Love is patient and kind, not jealous, not boastful, not proud, rude, or selfish, not easily angered, and keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not gloat over other people's sins, but takes its delight in the truth. Love always bears up, always trusts, always hopes, always endures. Love never ends. Prophecies will pass, tongues will cease, knowledge will pass. For now we see obscurely in a mirror, but then it will be face to face. Now I know partly, then I will know fully, just as God has fully known me. But for now these Three things last: trust, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. First, I would like to thank a few people, especially my brothers, Paul and Andrew, as well as Paul's wife Shannon and Andrew's fiance Abby, and of course Kylie, for just the amazing way that we were able to support our dad and each other during this time. We really were such a great team. I've heard from other people in similar situations, it's not always this way. And one of our dad's constant concerns was that we all got along. And we could always tell him truthfully that we did. I also wanted to thank my dad's sister Vivian and brother-in-law Alan, who can't be here today, they're in England. They came over very soon after he was diagnosed with cancer and spent 2 months here when he was at his worst. And they provided so much care and love and laughter during that time. And I'm sure that's part of the reason that he had a long period of getting better. I also want to give a special thank you to 7 women who so lovingly helped us care for our dad over this last year. Joan, Tammy, Allison, Sharon, Lisa, Pam, and Amanda. I think some of them are here today. This morning I was given a trial of sorts. I lost my speech on the computer. And I think it was tied to the verses I just read, because you see when your immediate response, how you respond to stress. My response was not how my dad's would have been. Let me just say that. His response would be, okay, there's a problem, what are we going to do, how do we resolve it? Kylie can attest that mine was not so gracious. But anyway, I do have a few notes, so forgive me if it's a little disjointed. I wanted to start with just a few memories of my dad as a kid growing up. He taught me many things. He taught me how to swim, which became one of my real passions as a kid. Taught us how to ice skate. He helped me with my math homework. He was such a whiz at math. I still have the little 4x6 times table that he made me in elementary school. I'd often see him on the roof of our house on Wellington, either fixing tiles or rescuing our cat Kimba, who would go up there and didn't know how to get down. So Mom would be fretting about him up on the roof, and he would rescue the cat. When we moved to Singapore, we stopped off in Hawaii on the way, which was nice. And I was 10 years old, and I loved to swim. I was a little fish when I was a kid, so he brought me out in the water, the high waves, and suggested that I go on his back to body surf down the waves. But I don't think either of us really realized how high these waves were. And it was the longest tumble underwater that I thought literally that I was going to die. And when we finished and he asked if I wanted to go again, I just said, no, that's okay. When we did move to Singapore, I used to wake up every morning and have breakfast with him. That was our time together. He would always, my dad could not cook for anything, but he made the best cup of tea. So he made me tea every morning. And I also remember, sometime, I can't really remember when this was, but somewhere in England, when he was just driving around the wrong way, around the roundabout. Were you there, Andrew? I don't remember. Mom was screaming, and he went around twice because he couldn't figure out which exit. Luckily, there were no cars coming, but he just was unflappable. It was just like, it's okay, you know. He also, Andrew mentioned the music. This was definitely a big part of our house. He played music. It was always loud, whatever it was. And he loved jazz and opera and the Grateful Dead. But the opera was, Mom didn't like opera, so we were fortunate that that was not usually blared so loud quite as often. He introduced me to Andrea Bocelli, though, who's kind of a medium opera, and I love him. Latin American music was also played all the time. He was a master storyteller. Really, he told stories like no one else. And I'll never forget when I was about, I think, 16. He came home from South Africa, and we had dinner, and he just proceeded to talk as if nothing was unusual. Told this long story, starting in the morning and going through the whole day. And the punchline was that he had been stabbed in the chest, and hadn't told any of us. And I mean, this is how he never gave away the story before the end. And I can tell you more about that later. But he had a great sense of humor, and unfortunately, I was and always have been way too serious. But we had many times of comparing, like, the Wiseman feet. Who had the best feet? He had the best feet, of course. And I think Andrew had the best after that. And then Ryan and Melissa might remember the Moo contest. Grandpa won that Moo contest, for sure. He was the best. He taught me many things about life, and he was a diplomat. He taught me how to see both sides of an issue, how to listen to people. He always remained calm in discussions. I didn't always model after that as well, but I try to improve on that every day. He had a can-do attitude, never to give up. He always encouraged me in whatever I was doing, and just told me to don't worry, just you can handle anything and keep on going. He was also a perfectionist. He didn't miss a detail, and he taught me if you do something, to do it right, and don't lose sight of those details. Probably the thing that most impacted me when I think about my dad is his relationship with my mom. They had been together since they were just teenagers. And when they danced, as we talked about, when they danced, it was true harmony and beauty. No matter, they may have had argument or something, but when they danced, they were one. They were amazing dancers together. And when you see your parents together all the years, you see the good, the bad, the ugly, and you think, well, of course they love each other. They've been together forever, and after all, so. But I obviously never knew the depth of how much my dad loved my mom until she first had her illness a couple years before she died, which caused her to drop down to 87 pounds. And then she later developed the cancer that took her life. The sacrifice and the love that I saw my dad that he poured out on her just took my breath away. And after she died, the grief that he felt was written all over him. There was a look in his eyes that was just a witness of the deepest level of loss. Through my parents, I really saw through him what true love really is. And in this year of trial for my dad, I saw a man who, like the person Job in the Bible, lost everything, but never once complained or blamed God or other people or became miserable. On the contrary, he continued to give his love to all of us as best as he could. Over this year, many would say that I or we have sacrificed a lot. But I would say no, I was given the gift and the blessing of being able to serve and love my dad in a small way compared to all that he's done for me. I'm honored to have been given that opportunity. He's with my mom now, dancing away and putting on the Ritz up there and getting a house ready for us, I believe. And I can't wait to see them. Dad, I love you and I miss you more than anything. Until I see you again, thank you.
Hello, thank you for all coming. We've received many messages of condolences from family, friends, and colleagues around the world, and I would like to share a couple of these at this time. The first one is from our Uncle Alan, who was married to Dad's sister, Vivian. As you know, your Wiseman grandmother was a florist. The family lived at the back and over the shop. As a young Jack, the lad of about 17 years, I had gathered up all my courage to enter the lion's den and face your grandmother in the shop. At the time, I thought she was a formidable lady. "Yes, can I help you?" she said as I stood before her. I would like some flowers," I nervously said. "Well, you've come to the right place then, haven't you? Of course, the reason I was in the shop was to go a-courting with the youngest girl in the family. Her mother was never impressed with me, and for some time mixed me up with some other guy. She shouted through the back door, 'Vivian, Peter's here.' However, while standing in the corner, waiting for the slip of a girl to appear, another guy arrived on the scene. I observed that Mother was much more human and almost friendly towards this newcomer. Viv showed up at last and said, 'Oh, you have met my brother then. George, this is Alan.' George said, 'I thought his name was Peter.' That was the beginning of a long friendship. It was the day that you, Paul, were born. Being Wiseman was not George's fault. I always made allowances for that fact. I guess that is why he was so good at cards and golf. Mind you, once I decided to always count the cards and shots played, he was never quite the same player. I was never ashamed to introduce him to any of my friends. He was always a hit with them. They never noticed his poor counting. When receiving a bottle of Chivas as a gift, which I had collected in great trouble, he was able to make it disappear so quickly that I never knew where it had gone. Into his liquor store, of course. Over time, I have known and lost many great and good friends. They were just ordinary, normal people who loved their family and were loyal to their friends. It would be disrespectful of all those other friends to say that George was the best of the bunch, but he was right there at the top of my list. I believe that we all started to lose George when he lost Edna. He no longer has pain and the other concerns for his family. He is with Edna now, and she is with him. I am grateful to have known them both. I have been a lucky man to have picked a Wiseman girl and a family all those years ago. You have all had the last 20 months to spend time with your dad. You have all put so much into that time, and you should be proud of what you have all done, and thankful to have been given that time. Another letter that we received from a friend and co-worker, Peter and Rosemary Wall. Dear Paul, Andrew, and Liz, it was with great sadness that we received the news of your father, George's death, albeit with a parallel sense of relief that his suffering had ended. Rosemary and I have so many good memories of time spent with George and Edna in Michigan, Singapore, Pennsylvania, and Florida. I first encountered the legendary Wiseman hospitality when I made my first visit to Troy office in 1973. The dinner table at your wing-like home was surrounded with visiting Ford people of several nationalities from all ranks of the company and all warmly welcomed. Thereafter, there were many similar occasions, and when we were able to reciprocate, George and Edna were excellent, charming guests, always engaging with other people and very positive presence. After one of those occasions, we received a gift of a set of serving spoons from them, and whenever they are used, we always have some conversation about something that happened with George and Edna. This gift will always be a much treasured item. Later, George was to have an important influence in my career when he recruited me into his team in Singapore, where we were together for 2 very enjoyable years. As a bachelor, I was always very appreciative of the continuing Wiseman hospitality. When my then girlfriend Rosemary came to visit, your mom gave her a very thorough check to be sure she was good enough to be my wife. Happily, the feedback was positive. For a while, the paths of George and I were separate, but in 1980, a newly married Rosemary and I moved to Michigan, and our friendship with George and Edna became closer, for which we were very grateful. Here I would like to record one aspect of their relationship which portrays George's everyday generosity and love for your mother. Whenever we went to a restaurant with them, they would usually order different main courses, and as soon as the meals came to the table, Edna would look across at George's plate and sigh, and right away say, "That's what I should have ordered." And very calmly, George would reach across and switch her plate with his, perhaps with a murmur, "Oh, Edna." In Singapore, we had the exciting event of Bruce Giddings' wedding to Chung Ying. When your father gave the bride away, the wedding party wore black tie, which George gave a bit of a problem, as his suit was designed for Scottish climates, not the tropics. I don't think I ever saw him looking hotter, and as soon as the photos were in the can, he shot off to change into something cooler. In those days, we did not have computers, and pages of sales statistics were prepared by hand, using calculators and pencils. I was always very nervous when presenting sales results to George. He could read a page of numbers better than I could read a book, and would unerringly spot the smallest mistake. It was only when we moved to computers that I could provide the accuracy that he rightly required. During that time, I again worked with George in the Troy office, and he was just an excellent boss, as always. A sense of humor was vital to deal with the daily pressures, and he was well refined. Though he had to be treated tenderly whenever West Ham Football Club had a bad result. But I have another enduring reason for being grateful to GAW, in that he helped me get into golf while I was in Michigan. After having some lessons, he and Tom Miller invited me to play with them every Saturday morning at a 9-hole course in Birmingham. Admittedly, the start was a little early at 6:30 a.m., and I was a bit zapped for the rest of the day. I still played regularly, and am very grateful to George for such an enduring gift. We did play a few times in Florida, once with Edna, who was not impressed when George turned their buggy much too sharply, and she slid gently out of her seat onto the grass. Happily with no injury, except her dignity, but George was told quite clearly that he was to blame. Later, we were able to repay some small part of the hospitality we had received from them when they visited us in Essex. On both occasions, we were so lucky that with the weather, UK speaking, in that we had hot sunny days and warm evenings, sitting in the garden with them and mutual friends, yarning and sipping wine, reminiscing until the small hours. I've met many people in my career with Ford, and some of them became good friends. But there were very few who became as close and reliable a friend as George Wiseman. And I can count them on the fingers of one hand. He was a man of calm temperament, integrity, humor, and kindness. I have been very fortunate to have known him, to have worked with him, and to have counted him as a good friend. We will treasure our memories of George and Edna. We send you our sincerest condolences and love. Dad was many things to many people, but to me, he was Dad. Where do I begin to talk about someone who means so much to me? There were many times when being my dad was not an easy task. I enjoyed driving Dad's cars from an early age, and will never forget the time Mom and Dad returned from bowling one night and his car was gone with my mates driving around the neighborhood. Dad asked, "Oh, where is the bloody car?" I can only imagine how frustrated he may have been with me many times over, but he never lost his cool. That's just how Dad was. He was the most steady and even-tempered person I know. I always knew I could talk to him about anything without him passing judgment. From this, I learned the value of truthfulness and integrity. I introduced Shannon to Mom and Dad when we were 18. From that day forward, Dad has been there for us. We relied on his knowledge and experience, his fix-it abilities, and gardening skills. Dad loved to putz around the garden, and just when you thought a lot was getting done, we'd find him out back chipping balls. Dad was a proud and loving grandpa. Ryan and Melissa have a wealth of memories that include the tumultuous Shanghai card games, the game that's better known as Dad Wins. Holiday dinners, long walks afterwards, and dancing until the wee hours, to mention just a few. One of the last significant memories is when Dad met his first grandson, Ian. He was convinced that his name ought to be George. Though it was too late to rename Ian, Dad still was and will always be an inspiration to us all.
And now any of you are welcome and invited, if you wish, to offer further words of tribute, keeping them brief, of course. Or if anyone would like to come and say a word, we would love to hear you.
George and I would be celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. You may think that's pretty stupid, two guys having a 50th anniversary. However, it was on November the 21st, a Wednesday evening in 1962, the day before I was to get married, to the lady sitting there, who worked with George. Now, I didn't know George, I knew about George at that time, and Barbara had said, please don't go out with your friends the night before you're to get married, because I don't want you rolling up the aisles smelling like a brewery or being late. So I said, fair enough. However, George suggested to Barbara, with others in the office, why don't we just have a drink before you take a few days off your wedding? Well, Barbara had told me that she wasn't going anywhere, so I called to see how she was that evening. Of course, one must never see the bride the night before, because otherwise the wedding would be a disaster. That's why we're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. And what happened, she wasn't home. So we all began to get worried. This is before cell phones and such things. I mean, you just jumble drums and keep your fingers crossed. So I finally went round to her house. Her parents were worried too, because Barbara hadn't showed up. Around 10 o'clock that evening, the door opened and in came Barbara, laughing her head off. Her mother said, you better be careful. In came George. And Barbara said, Peter, this is George. George later said that I looked like I was going to deck him one, and he beat a hasty retreat. From that day on, soon after that, George and I became very close friends, and we have been very dear friends right up until the end. He's still in my heart. And it will be this year, on Wednesday, November the 21st, the evening of Thanksgiving, which is very appropriate because George was very close to me and Barbara, and we were close to George and Edna. There's just one thing I wish to correct. George did not usually win at cards. Edna did. And yet George was always accused of being the person that won. And to show how stupid this was, one evening, many, many times we would get together on a Friday or a Saturday evening to play cards. And around 10:30, 11 o'clock, Edna would disappear into the kitchen to start getting what we would refer to as our English nosh up. Barbara then went to the bathroom. George and I were losing at cards because we were partners, and Barbara and Edna were partners. I forget what we were playing, bridge or something, I can't remember. So George and I quickly cooked the books. We fiddled the cards, we got it all worked out, and when the girls came back, we were sitting there innocently. They still won. And George and I couldn't believe it, that my goodness, here those two women, particularly Edna, did it again. George and I were two Essex lads. We lived on the district line. We both supported West Ham. He played a lot of soccer and I was a bike rider. He was good at soccer and I wasn't a bad time trialist. Everything we did, we understood one another. I never had to explain anything to George and he never explained. We just knew there was a great simpatico. George was truly my friend.
Anyone else?
There are two more emails that we had from friends overseas that I'd like to read. The first one is from Brian Hayden. It says, Dear Liz, Paul, and Andrew, Susan and I are so very sorry to hear that George has slipped away to join his beloved Eds. They were such a fabulous and loving couple, and I'm absolutely sure that they will now be together where they belong in peaceful reunion. Your dad was a kind and generous man who thought the world of his family and would have taken huge comfort from your constant care during his illness. There's just no substitute for a loving family to illuminate your world and share your life. It is such a long time since we were together in Singapore, but I remember it all as if it was yesterday. George was never really a boss in the normal sense, much more of a good friend and brilliant mentor. Whatever I achieved in my business life, it was always thanks to his wise counsel and unflappable approach, which informed my own way of working. Very many times when faced with difficult situations or decisions, I would just pause and think, what would George do? And somehow he was there over my shoulder giving me the right guidance. I could go on paragraph after paragraph remembering all the trips we shared over much of the world, the Far East, India, Turkey, Africa, and traveling with George was always a pleasure. But perhaps the memories that mean the most are visiting your mom and dad in Birmingham during that period when I would have the opportunity to visit the Troy offices quite frequently. It was always just like coming home. I'm sorry I was never able to get across the ocean to see George as I would have dearly liked, but rest assured I was able to keep in touch with his progress through countless friends like Bernard and Peter who diligently kept us informed. Guys, our thoughts and prayers are with you all. It's a tragic loss, but a small comfort perhaps to know that such bravely endured suffering is over. And the other one is from Alec Murray. Liz, Paul, and Andrew, I deeply regret your father's demise. He obviously made a big fight of it, bearing in mind you informed us a while ago that he was sick. I will miss him immensely, and the memory of our last meeting in Vero Beach about 3 years ago will stay with me forever. George and I first met in 1962 when I joined Ford Tractors at Ilford. I was a raw, wet behind the ears youth who thought he knew everything, but in fact knew very little about how the business world operated. Your dad very quickly put me straight in a very pleasant but firm way. At that time, there was a gang of 4 working under the eccentric management of Arbor Miller. We were your father, George Mackenzie, John Lee, and myself. We worked so well together and had a lot of fun. Unfortunately, the time was only about 2 years, at which point your dad went to the States and I took over his job, a hard act to follow because what George did not know about tractor dealers was not worth knowing. I didn't see much of your father until after that, as I left tractors in '68 to join Cars and then Credit. However, in 1982, I was transferred to Dearborn, whereupon we met up again and had many great social times together with your mother and father. We played bridge regularly at your home in Birmingham, usually to the accompaniment of great opera music, which your dad loved. There was many a bridge argument at the table, but none which in the slightest way affected our relationship. These were great times. That ended in 1985 when I returned to Ford Credit in the UK, and we kept in touch primarily through Christmas cards. But we still had the good services of your family when son David was stranded in Michigan at one time without a place to stay, and your mom and dad very kindly took him in. Helen and I were always grateful for that generosity which showed the good heart at the center of your family. Finally, Helen and I met George 3 years ago in Florida and stayed overnight in your spare apartment at Vero Beach. To the last, George was a gentleman and friend, as he called a few of our old tractor colleagues, and we had a great evening recalling old times. Another occasion I'll remember for the rest of my days. As you can see, our lives touched only briefly over the last 50 years, but the touch was memorable, and every time was a reminder of the great friendship we developed together. Knowing that George is no longer with us leaves a tear in my eye, and being a Scottish accountant, that does not happen often. Thank you for including me in this news. Unfortunately, we can't attend the gathering. Our thoughts are with you, and we ask you to accept our condolences. I will miss your dad.
We do not lose courage, though our outer self is heading for decay, our inner self is being renewed daily. For our light and transient troubles are achieving for us an everlasting glory, whose weight is beyond description. We concentrate not on what is seen, but what is not seen, since things seen are temporary, but things not seen are eternal. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid.
I've been privileged to learn of George through the words of his children to me, and today from others of you who have spoken, the words of those who couldn't be here who were read. Here is some of what I think I've learned. That his life was filled with travels, that in fact long journeys were part of what defined him. Started early enough in his boyhood, when he, like many other children, Edna included, were evacuated from the city, far places where they could be safe from the bombing. More than once, he had to leave and return. Then just little travels for a while until the big one came, at his repeated request to bring his family across the ocean from England's green and pleasant land to this raucous one. But his work from here became largely about journeys. Journey upon journey, Japan, Pakistan, Middle East, India. Each one 4 times a year, and then going off to Africa, South America, Australia, other parts of Asia, Middle East. In the 2 years in Singapore, his career kept taking him to far distances and then back again, over and over. And then came other journeys. gone to Vero Beach, and all the ones to England and back, and here and back. And then 7 years ago, he began the terrible journey of grief. Then the journey of his own pain and long illness. And 11 days ago, his final journey. His life was many departures and many arrivals. What has struck me as I have been learning about him is that to an unusual extent for someone who moved around so much on these ceaseless travels, there was a deep, abiding, rooted center. Constancy. Something like, for all his activities, listening stillness. You have to be that if you're someone who truly listens. And I gather that George was a consummate listener. That's what all those career travels were about, after all, sitting down with people in far places to hear their interests and their concerns, their disagreements, in such a way as to build bridges and maintain the strength of those bridges. That's what he was good at. He was a solid human being with an evenness of temperament. Even in considerable suffering, he did not complain. He was a positive spirit. He was patient. I hear that Edna could sometimes be a storm, and that George, in reply, would be a presence of welcome calm. I gather it was this steadfastness in him that gave such a wonderful shape to his love. His children speak of how very present to them he was as a father. He listened. He steadily encouraged. His care and concern were constant, even at the very end. When his consciousness had already mostly left him and he was no longer able to open his eyes, even then, with almost nothing left, the words came out. I love you. That's steady. It's constancy. And that was his way of love for Edward. Here were these two teenagers dancing in a dance before it was done, went on for more than half a century. It was always there for them, quick and easy and ready for them. It was their thrill and they were good at it, and heads turned. For me, the dancing has become a sort of parallel for what I think I've learned. Those countless steps they took and kept taking, like a long journey, but a journey with holding on in it. Holding especially when things got hard, which you did see in him with such tender strength when Edna's illness came. They were a dance, embracing, releasing, turning round and round a center that, as it turned out, was a magnificent love. It was the shape of George's life. Leave and return, yet holding fast to love, always returning to the hands. George and Edna were not ones to go to church, though they did have their first dance at church, and were married in one. And now some of you have come twice to a church to honor and remember them well. But here's the truth. A dance floor can be a kind of church. especially where what happens there is generous, joyous, hanging on love. Jesus was a dancer like that. It's what you do at a big wedding party when the water gets turned to wine. I think that deep down in the heart of things, it is what we all were made for. With countless different ways of doing it with the days and nights that we're given. Our lives are a journey of many departures and many arrivals. We were made for that. And through all those changes of circumstance or scenery, we were also made, all of us, to be a steady, loving, listening presence. A life rightly lived is the joining of great movement and of loving embrace, which is to say, life rightly lived has the distinctive shape of a dance, and that was exactly the shape of George's life. With all my heart, I believe that God smiles on such a life. I believe that love has shined beautifully on those of you who got to see it in the way George lived. And you shined it back toward him. And now you grieve as you must. And I pray that you grieve well, leaning on the love that will sustain you and remembering that grief itself is a form of gratitude. It is also a form of hope. Some of you pictured set free at last from disabling illness and pain, George and Edna, young again, dancing in perfect light of perfect love. They look over their shoulder, I think, and say to you, this is how it's done. Come dance with us. Let us pray. Gracious God, who brings us all into this world and calls us to another world and gives the best of gifts to the living and the dead. We bless you and thank you for the life of George Wiseman among us. We relinquish him into the fullness of your life and love and into the blessed rest of everlasting peace. Now deal graciously with his loved ones in their grief. Grant them healing from their sorrows and confidence in your good love and strength to face the days to come. Amidst all that we cannot understand, may we know your peace. Grant us courage and tenderness of love for one another. Fill us with good hope and always with love. We offer now the words that Jesus gave his disciples to pray together, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Let us stand to sing our concluding.
Praise,
invited to join them in a post-celebration celebration, which is to take place at Sava's restaurant, which is just close by on State Street. You receive now the closing blessing. Now may the peace of God, which passes all understanding, keep your hearts and your minds. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May God's own face shine upon you and be gracious to you and give you